winter. So the first moon of winter would be what I was talking about, mentioned before. It would be the full moon of the third new moon before the winter solstice. And that, I believe, would have been the date for that full moon, would have been the date for the Decemblot, which would have been in remembrance of the sort of female ancestors. And it also would have been the date, I think, for sacrifices to Frey, because it's the beginning of winter. And it's mentioned in Snorri's Heimskringla about how the pagans had three main festivals. The first was at the onset of winter, at the beginning of winter, for peace and good harvest. Till ours Okfritha, for good year, for a good year and peace. And also maybe an alpha bloat, a sacrifice to the elves, because that's mentioned. So, at the beginning of winter, there seems to be a sacrifice to the elves. So there's a lot going on for the Decemblot. And interestingly, the Decemblot is that full moon it's the most referenced heathen festival in all the sagas, even more than Yule. It's got many more references. But as I was saying to you before, there's lots of academics say, this festival would probably occur around October time, but they were unable to actually put a date on it. And I think the reason they were unable to put an exact date on it is because there wasn't one. It was actually on a full moon, on that full moon, the full moon of the third new moon before the winter solstice. Interestingly, I mean, the Celtic peoples were sort of Christianized a lot earlier than the sort of Germanic and Norse peoples. But I think that what a lot of people refer to Halloween now as Samhain, summer's end in Gaelic, is probably the same, probably originally was a lunar festival as well. But I haven't really got any evidence for that, because there is a lot less evidence because they were Christianized so much earlier. So whatever was there has kind of disappeared. So that would be the first moon, the Decemblot. This moon coming up on Monday is the second moon of winter. And then with the third moon of winter, you enter the first Yule lunation, because there were always two lunations called Yule. So in Anglo-Saxon culture, that seems to have been Mother's Night. So this would be from this would be the first new moon, the last, or if you like, the last new moon before the winter solstice. So possibly the full moon of that new moon before the winter solstice could be before the winter solstice, or it could occur after the winter solstice, depending when it falls. So that's the earlier one. I mean, I think it's in something called the Menologium, which is an Anglo-Saxon preface to an 11th century version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's in the Menologium, which is like it's a Christian thing. It's a liturgical roundup of the year, but it mentions Era Yeola and Aftera Yeola, which to a modern English ear, you'd look at those and think, okay, let's try and, this is the ancestor of our language. Let's have a look at it and think Era Yeola. So Yeola is like Yule, and Era, that could be earlier. The before, it's before, because that old expression, ere long he will be dead, or whatever, or ere spring or whatever. The ere would be, it's a shortened version, I imagine, of before. And Aftera, well, that's clearly like after. So you've got before and after Yule. After Yule. So what are they before and after? Oh, well, a lot of people would jump to the conclusion that it's the solstice. Yule is the solstice. But actually, if you consult Anglo-Saxon dictionaries, you'll see that the actual meaning of era just means earlier, and Aftera means later. So I'm sure Aftera has evolved into after, but its meaning has changed somewhat. So it actually originally meant just later. So you've got the before Yule, the earlier Yule, sorry, the earlier Yule and the later Yule, just 2 Yule lunations, with the solstice having a part to play in it, but not the Yule is not solstice, is not the solstice. It's similarly at midsummer in the Venerable Bede's description that he wrote in a book called De Temporum Ratione, which is the reckoning of time. He wrote it in about 725 CE. He says that the Anglo-Saxons celebrated their according to the moon, reckon time according to the moon, and the summer, similar just as midwinter has 2 Yule lunations, so midsummer also has 2 lither lunations. So it has the lithe months of summer, the sort of like would be again two lunations at the sort of extremes of the sort of solar light. Yeah, so but the most important one for Yule, the second Yule moon, I think would be the sort of Nordic Yule, the festival of Yule. So that would be the full moon of the first new moon after the winter solstice, when that was full. I think this year it occurs about quite late, about the 28th of January before it gets to be full. And I think that was when the Yule was the full moon of the first new moon after the winter solstice. You then go on and I think you have another moon which doesn't really have any sort of special associations with it. And then you come on to the 6th moon of winter, which is the Disting moon, which again, the name Disting, it seems to be like a gathering, an assembly that also venerated the Decia. So it seems to me that although the Decia bloat that we know from Norway is quite separate from the Decia bloat, Decia thing that was celebrated in Sweden, I quite like the idea that in wintertime, the ancestors were venerated, or it was a time when the other world and the supernatural, the dead, the ghosts, the ancestors drew near, and they're marked at either end of the winter season. At the beginning of the winter season, you have the Decia bloat, and albeit it's separated in time and space by a different reference, but at the end of winter, there's also an attestation for a heathen festival venerating the Decia at the end of winter. And then the following one, you then get beginning of the first 6 moons of summer.